She thought she was rebuilding a chapel. Instead, she uncovered the truth of her life. Hidden letters waited under the altar for years. Single mother restored a desert chapel and found her past beneath its altar. If you discovered letters in a place tied to your past, would you read them or leave the truth buried? The sun was dying when they arrived. Elena watched it bleed across the horizon, red and orange smearing into purple as her Honda Civic coughed to a stop in front of what used to be a chapel. The building rose from the desert floor like something the earth had tried to swallow and given up on halfway. Adobe walls the color of old bone, cracked and crumbling. A roof that had caved inward on one side, exposing wooden beams gone black with rot. The front door hung from a single hinge, swaying slightly in the wind that never stopped out here. Sophia pressed her face against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass. She was 9 years old, too young to understand why they'd left everything behind. Old enough to know they were running. "Is this it?" she asked quietly. Elena's hands were still on the steering wheel, knuckles white. She didn't want to let go. Letting go meant stepping out. Stepping out meant this was real. "Yeah, mija," she said. "This is home." The lie tasted like dust. She thought about the other home, the one they'd left 3 states behind. The kitchen with its yellow wallpaper and the crack in the ceiling she used to stare at when she couldn't sleep. The bedroom where she'd learned to pack a suitcase in under 5 minutes without making a sound. The bathroom mirror where she'd practiced smiling so Sophia wouldn't see the bruises blooming purple beneath her sleeves. She remembered Sophia's face in the rearview mirror that night, wide eyes catching streetlight, small hands clutching her stuffed rabbit. They'd driven in silence for 2 hours before Sophia finally asked where they were going. Elena hadn't known how to answer. "Away. Somewhere he won't find us. Somewhere we can disappear." The chapel had been listed online for $1,200. "Fixer-upper," the ad said. "Remote location. Sold as is." Elena had every cent she owned in cash in an envelope under the driver's seat. She'd wired the money from a gas station in Arizona, signed the paperwork with a name that wasn't quite hers, and kept driving. Now they were here, miles from the nearest town. No neighbors, no witnesses, just desert and wind and a building that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it wrong. But it was theirs, and no one knew where to find them. Inside, the chapel smelled like time dust and decay and something older, something that felt like memory. The floor was dirt, packed hard by decades of footsteps that had stopped coming. Holes in the roof let in columns of fading light. The walls were bare except for the ghosts of where things used to hang: crosses, paintings, prayers. Elena spread their sleeping bags on the ground, while Sophia explored with a flashlight, the beam cutting through shadows. They had so little. 2 bags of clothes, a box of canned food, a camping stove, everything they needed to survive and nothing more. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She lay in her sleeping bag, staring up at the broken ceiling where stars showed through. The wind pressed against the walls, finding every crack, every weakness. It sounded like the building was breathing. "Mama?" Sophia's voice was small in the darkness. Elena rolled over. "Yeah, baby." "I'm scared." Elena reached out and found her daughter's hand. "You want me to tell you a story?" Sophia nodded. So Elena told her about a brave girl who lived in a castle made of sand. How the girl was afraid at first because the castle looked like it might fall down. But every day, she made it stronger. She patched the walls, she fixed the roof, and slowly, the castle became the safest place in the whole world. A place where nothing bad could reach her. Did she live there forever? Sophia asked. "As long as she needed to," Elena said. Sophia's breathing eventually evened out. Sleep came to children easier. They still believed in safe places. Elena waited until she was sure Sophia was out, then slipped outside. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, flat and empty and honest in a way that cities never were. She held an unlit cigarette between her fingers. She'd found it in the glove compartment, left over from a version of herself she barely remembered. She didn't smoke, but holding it made her feel like someone who had choices. The silence out here was different. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of space. Room to breathe, room to think, room to be erased if that's what she needed. She turned back toward the chapel. Through the doorway, she could see the altar at the far end, a raised platform of stone, cracked down the middle, covered in 40 years of dust. Something about it caught her attention, held it. She didn't know why. It was just an altar, just stone, but it felt like it was waiting. "Mama?" Sophia's voice drifted out from inside, sleepy, uncertain. "Are we going to be okay?" Elena looked at the cigarette in her hand, at the desert, at the chapel that was now the only thing standing between them and the world. "Yeah, baby," she called back. "We will be." She dropped the cigarette in the dirt and went back inside. She didn't believe it yet. But maybe if she said it enough times, it would become true. Morning came with light, the color of bleached bone. Elena woke to the sound of Sophia breathing beside her and the wind testing the walls. She lay still for a moment, letting the desert silence settle into her bones. Then she got up and began the work of making this place livable. She mixed adobe mud the way she'd learned from a YouTube video on her phone before the battery died. Dirt and water and straw, kneaded until it held together. Her hands remembered something her body had forgotten. Strength. The kind that came from building instead of bracing for impact. She pressed the mixture into the cracks in the walls, smoothing it with her palms. Slow work. Meditative. Each patch a small act of reclaiming. Sophia set up school at a table they'd made from a plank of wood and 2 cinder blocks. She worked through math problems in a notebook with a chewed pencil, glancing up every few minutes to watch her mother work. Elena could feel her daughter's eyes on her, checking, making sure she was still there. "Mama?" Sophia asked. "What is this place supposed to be?" Elena wiped mud from her hands. "A chapel. A church. Did people pray here?" "I think so. A long time ago." Sophia considered this. "Do you believe in God?" Elena didn't know how to answer. She'd never been religious. Her mother had taken her to Mass twice when she was young, then stopped without explanation. God had always felt like something other people had access to. A door she'd never found the key for. "I don't know, mija," she said finally. "But there's something about this place. It feels like it's listening." Sophia nodded like that made perfect sense. By afternoon, Sophia had found a lizard basking on a stone near the well. She caught it carefully, held it in cupped hands, then transferred it to a mason jar with holes punched in the lid. "His name is Miguel," she announced. Elena looked at the lizard, small and green and utterly unbothered by its captivity.
"Why Miguel?"
"He looks like a Miguel." Sophia carried the jar everywhere after that. She talked to Miguel while she swept dust from corners, while she arranged the candles they'd salvaged from a box in the back room. Elena watched her daughter adapt, saw how children could make friends out of loneliness, how they could survive on less and still find joy. Something in her chest loosened. Not hope exactly, but space for it. The drive into town took 40 minutes on a road that was barely paved. The town itself was small one main street, a hardware store, a grocery with faded awnings. Elena moved through it like a ghost, bought wood and nails and canned beans, paid in cash. The cashier didn't look at her face. No one did. She'd learned how to be invisible a long time ago, how to take up less space, how to make sure no one remembered you were there. On the drive back, she passed a sign that read, "Population 847. She did the math. That meant 849 now, counting her and Sophia. 2 more people trying to disappear into the desert's empty spaces. At night, the coyotes sang. Elena lay in her sleeping bag, listening to their voices rise and fall across the darkness. They sounded lonely. Or maybe they sounded free. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. She thought about her mother, cold, distant. A woman who'd moved through Elena's childhood like a shadow, present but never quite there. Elena had spent years trying to understand what she'd done wrong. What had made her mother so angry, so unreachable. But there were no answers. Just silence and the shape of something missing. She thought about her grandmother, the one her mother never spoke about. The ghost in their family's silence. Elena didn't even know her name. Didn't know if she was alive or dead, just that mentioning her had always made her mother's face close like a fist. Maybe that's what families were. Collections of silences. Stories buried so deep they became the foundation you built your life on without ever knowing they were there. The next morning, Elena decided to measure the altar. It needed work. The stone was cracked, unstable. If they were going to stay here, she needed to make sure nothing would collapse on them in the night. She knelt in front of it, running her hands along the base. The stone was cool under her palms, solid. She pressed against it, testing for weakness. That's when she felt it shift, a piece of the altar's base loose, almost imperceptible. She pressed harder, and it moved, grinding slightly against the stone beneath. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She worked her fingers into the gap and pried. The stone came free with a sound like a breath being released. Underneath was darkness, and inside that darkness, something waited. Elena pulled the stone free and set it aside. Dust rose in the beam of her flashlight, particles dancing like they'd been waiting decades to move. She aimed the light into the gap. There was a hollow space beneath the altar. Small, deliberate, and inside it, something wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands shook as she reached in. The object was rectangular, heavier than she expected. She unwrapped it carefully, the cloth crumbling at her touch like it might disintegrate completely if she wasn't gentle enough. A wooden box, old. The edges worn smooth by time or touch. No lock, just a simple latch. Tarnished but intact. Her heart was beating too fast. She could hear it in her ears, louder than the wind outside. She opened the box. Inside, letters tied with string, photographs with curled edges, a rosary with wooden beads, darkened by years of hands, the smell of old paper and something else lavender maybe, or just the memory of it. Elena lifted the first letter. The paper was brittle, yellowed. The handwriting was careful, practiced. Dated June 1952, and at the top, an address. Para Maria Elena Vargas. Elena stopped breathing. Maria Elena Vargas, her grandmother's name. The name her mother had never spoken aloud. The name Elena had only seen once, on a birth certificate she'd found in a drawer when she was 12. She'd asked her mother about it, and her mother's face had gone hard as stone. "She's dead," her mother had said. "That's all you need to know." The door had closed, and Elena had learned not to open it again. But here was her grandmother's name, written in ink that had survived 50 years of silence. Elena waited until Sophia was asleep before she read. She sat near the door where the moonlight came through, holding the letter close to a candle. The Spanish was formal, old-fashioned. She had to read slowly, translating in her head. "Querida Maria Elena, I write this as you asked, so there will be a record when the time comes. You have made your choice, and though my heart grieves, I understand. The child will be cared for. The family in California is good. They will raise her as their own. They will give her what we cannot, a life without shame, without whispers. You have sacrificed everything. Your family, your name, the future you might have had. I pray God sees this and grants you peace. But I know peace does not come easily to mothers who give away their children. The secret is safe with me. No one will know. You will remain here, as we agreed, until it is time to leave. The chapel will be your sanctuary, as it has always been. Que Dios te bendiga, Padre Miguel. Elena read it twice, then a third time. Her hands were shaking so badly the candlelight flickered across the page. A child, given away, California, a family. Her mother had been born in California, had been adopted. She'd told Elena that once, in passing, like it didn't matter. Like it was just a fact, with no weight attached. But this, Elena looked at the date again. 1952, the year her mother was born. The pieces were aligning, but she didn't want them to. Didn't want to see what they were forming. She set the letter down and picked up one of the photographs. A young woman standing in front of the chapel, this chapel, before time had broken it. The woman was maybe 20, dark hair pulled back. Dark eyes looking directly at the camera, her expression serious, almost defiant. Elena brought the photograph closer to the candle. She knew that face. The shape of the mouth. The way the sadness sat in the eyes, like it had always been there and always would be. She was looking at herself, 50 years younger. A different life, the same bones. Her grandmother, the woman who had lived here, who had given birth in shame and secrecy, who had handed her baby to strangers and stayed behind in this chapel, alone with her prayers and her silence. Mama? Elena jumped. The photograph slipped from her fingers. Sophia was sitting up in her sleeping bag, eyes half open. What's wrong? Elena wiped her face quickly. She hadn't realized she was crying. Nothing, mija. Just dust. Sophia blinked, still mostly asleep. You're always crying about dust. Elena laughed a wet, broken sound. Yeah. This place has a lot of it. Sophia lay back down, already drifting. Within minutes, her breathing evened out again. Elena gathered the letters and photographs carefully, placed them back in the box, and hid it under her sleeping bag. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her mind wouldn't stop turning over the words. A life without shame. Without whispers, her mother had grown up not knowing. Had lived her whole life as someone else's daughter. And her real mother, Elena's grandmother, had stayed here, alone, praying in the ruins of her own choices. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay listening to the wind and the coyotes and the sound of the chapel settling around them. And when she finally did drift off, she dreamed. The chapel was full of people. Women in long dresses, men in hats, candles burning at the altar, voices rising in prayer. Spanish words she didn't quite understand, but felt in her chest like something remembered. And at the altar, kneeling, a young woman with dark hair, her grandmother, praying, weeping, and all around her, the walls holding secrets, keeping them safe in the stone. Elena read the letters in secret, late at night, after Sophia had fallen asleep. After the desert had gone quiet, except for the wind, she would pull the box from beneath her sleeping bag, light a candle, and let her grandmother's life unfold in careful handwriting and faded ink. Each letter revealed more. Maria Elena had been 20 years old, unmarried, pregnant. In 1952, in a town so small everyone knew everyone's shame, this was unforgivable. Her family had disowned her, told her to leave and never come back, told her she was dead to them. Father Miguel had offered sanctuary, a place to hide until the baby came. She could stay in the chapel, work as its keeper, clean, pray, wait. So she had. One letter described her days, the silence, the heat pressing through the walls, the way she would stand at the door and watch the road, hoping someone, anyone might come. But no one did. She was alone with her prayers and her growing belly and the terrible certainty that nothing good was waiting on the other side of this. Another letter spoke of the birth, how she'd done it alone in the small room behind the altar, how she'd bitten down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming because she didn't want God to hear her, how she'd held the baby afterward, a girl, tiny and perfect, and known she had only hours before they came to take her away. Elena read that letter twice, her throat tight. She thought about Sophia, about holding her for the first time in a hospital that smelled like disinfectant and fear, about how she'd looked down at her daughter's face and made a promise: I will protect you. I will keep you safe. No matter what. Maria Elena had made the same promise, and then she'd had to break it. The letter that described the day the baby was taken was the hardest to read. Father Miguel had arranged everything. A Catholic family in California. Good people. They couldn't have children of their own. They would raise the baby as theirs, give her a life, a name, a future without the stain of illegitimacy. Maria Elena had dressed the baby in a white gown she'd sewn herself, had held her one last time, had kissed her forehead and whispered a prayer and handed her to strangers. And then she'd watch them drive away. They told me to forget, Maria Elena wrote, to disappear, to live as if she never existed. But how do you forget your own child? How do you pretend your heart isn't walking around in someone else's arms? Elena sat with that letter in her lap, staring at the words until they blurred. That baby was her mother, her cold, distant, unreachable mother. The woman who had moved through Elena's childhood like a ghost, who had never hugged her without stiffness, who had looked at Elena sometimes with an expression Elena couldn't name, something like grief, something like anger. Now she understood. Her mother had grown up not knowing where she came from, not knowing she'd been loved and given away, not knowing her real mother had stayed in this chapel for 40 years, praying for forgiveness she'd never receive. Everything made sense now. The coldness, the silence, the way her mother had flinched whenever Elena asked about family, about history, about the past. You couldn't love what you didn't understand. And her mother had never understood why she felt so broken. Elena felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. A strange kinship with the grandmother she'd never met. Both of them outcasts. Both of them mothers trying to survive in a world that offered no mercy. Both of them carrying silence like a second skin. She began to restore the chapel differently after that. Not just to make it livable, but to honor it. To honor her. She cleaned the altar until the stone shone. Replaced the broken windows with salvaged glass. Painted the walls white again, the way they must have been when Maria Elena lived here. Every act of restoration felt like an apology, like a conversation with a ghost. Sophia noticed. She watched her mother work with a focus that bordered on obsession. "Mama?" she asked one afternoon. "Why does it matter so much?" Elena paused, paintbrush in hand. "Because someone loved this place once." Who? Someone like us. Sophia seemed to accept that. She went back to playing with Miguel the lizard, and Elena went back to painting. But that night, after Sophia was asleep, Elena pulled out the box one more time. There was one letter left, thicker than the others, sealed with red wax that had cracked with age but never broken. She held it in her hands, feeling its weight. This one was different. She could sense it. This one wasn't written to Father Miguel or to anyone else. This one was written to whoever found it. Elena's hands trembled. Part of her wanted to open it immediately. Part of her wanted to bury it again and pretend she'd never seen it. Because some truths, once known, couldn't be unknown. She set the letter down beside the candle and stared at it. The wax seal caught the light, red as blood, red as birth, red as all the things women carried in silence. Outside, the wind picked up, The chapel walls held steady, and somewhere in the darkness, the desert waited. Elena picked up the letter. She broke the seal. The wax cracked under her thumb. Elena unfolded the letter slowly, carefully, like it might dissolve if she wasn't gentle enough. The handwriting was different. Shakir. The ink had bled in places, smudged by something water, maybe, or tears. It was dated 1991, 40 years after the first letter. And it wasn't addressed to Father Miguel. It was addressed to no one, and to everyone. To whoever finds this, my name is Maria Elena Vargas. I am 73 years old. I am dying. The doctor says I have months, maybe weeks. I have made my peace with this. I have lived longer than I deserved. But before I go, I need to say what I could never say while there was still a chance someone might hear. I had a daughter once. I gave her away because the world told me I had no choice. Because I was young and unmarried and filled with shame. Because I believed the lie that some children are born into sin and must be hidden away to keep the world clean. I thought I was saving her, giving her a better life, a family who could love her without the weight of my mistakes. But I never stopped thinking about her. Never stopped wondering who she became, what her laugh sounded like, if she was happy, if she knew she was loved, even if she didn't know who loved her. I tried to find her once, 15 years after I gave her away. I saved money. I traveled to California. I went to the church where Father Miguel had arranged the adoption, but they said the family had moved. No forwarding address, no records. The trail was cold. I stood outside that church for an hour, hoping, praying, that maybe she would walk by, that I would recognize her face, my face, and she would recognize mine, that we would find each other by some miracle. But miracles are for people who deserve them, so I came back here, to this chapel, the only place I've ever belonged. I stayed, I cleaned, I prayed. I grew old in the silence. People in town forgot about me, or maybe they never cared enough to remember. I became part of the walls, part of the dust, and every night I prayed for forgiveness. From God, from my daughter, from myself. But forgiveness is not something you can earn through silence. If you are reading this, you are my blood. You found your way here, just as I always hoped someone would. Maybe you are my daughter. Maybe you are her child. Maybe you are someone further down the line, carrying a piece of me in your bones without knowing it. I want you to know this. This chapel is not a place of shame. It is a place of survival. I survived here, alone, forgotten. But I survived, and so will you. Do not carry my silence. Do not let it become your inheritance. Speak the things I couldn't. Love the people I couldn't reach. Forgive what I couldn't forgive. I am leaving this here because I believe, despite everything, that the truth will find its way to the right person. And when it does, maybe it will be enough. Maybe you will understand that I loved her, even when I couldn't keep her, even when I had to let her go. Tell her, if you can. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never stopped. Con todo mi corazón, Maria Elena Vargas. Elena's hands were shaking so hard the letter rattled. Tears blurred the words, but she'd already read them. They were burned into her now. Her grandmother hadn't abandoned her mother out of cruelty. She'd been forced to, told to, shamed into it by a world that punished women for being human. And her mother, cold, distant, angry, had grown up never knowing she'd been loved, never knowing where she came from, never knowing that somewhere a woman was praying for her every single night in a chapel in the desert. Elena thought about her own mother's face, the hardness in it, the way she'd looked at Elena sometimes like she was searching for something and couldn't find it. She thought about the silence between them, the distance that had always felt like rejection but now felt like something else, like armor, like survival. Her mother had been given away and told it didn't matter, told to be grateful, told to forget. But you couldn't forget a wound like that. You could only learn to live around it. Elena looked at Sophia, asleep in her sleeping bag, one hand clutching Miguel's jar. Her daughter, the one she'd run across 3 states to protect, the one she'd promised to keep safe no matter what. She understood now. Trauma passed down through generations like heirlooms, silent and invisible. The things we don't say become the things our children carry. The wounds we hide become the distance they feel. But it didn't have to be that way. Elena could choose to speak, to break the silence her grandmother and mother had carried, to tell Sophia the truth, all of it, so she would never grow up wondering why she felt broken. She stood slowly, the letter still in her hand, and walked to the altar. The stone was smooth under her palm, cool, solid. She placed the letter on the altar like an offering. "I understand now," she whispered. The chapel was silent, but it felt like it was listening. Outside, the wind had stopped. The desert was holding its breath, and Elena realized she wasn't here by accident. She'd been led here, by choices, by desperation, by something older than either. This chapel had been waiting. For her grandmother, for her mother, for her. And now, finally, the silence could end. Elena woke the next morning with purpose. Not the frantic, survival-driven kind she'd lived with for years. Something steadier, deeper. She had work to do. The chapel transformed under her hands. She patched the remaining cracks in the walls with fresh adobe, smoothing them until they disappeared. She climbed onto the roof and replaced the damaged beams, her muscles remembering strength she'd forgotten she had. She swept the floor clean, scrubbed the altar until the stone gleamed, replaced the broken windows with glass she salvaged from an abandoned house 20 miles away. Every nail she hammered felt like a declaration. Every board she placed felt like a promise. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was rebuilding, reclaiming. Sophia noticed. She watched her mother work with something like awe. The frantic edge that had lived in Elena's movements for months, the constant looking over her shoulder, the way her hands used to shake, was gone, replaced by focus, by certainty. One afternoon, Sophia sat on the front step, Miguel's jar beside her, and said, "You're different, Mama." Elena paused, hammer in hand. "Different how?" "I don't know." Sophia tilted her head, considering. "Less scared, maybe. Or more like you." Elena smiled, set the hammer down, and came to sit beside her daughter. "I think I'm just becoming myself." "Who were you before?" "Someone who was trying really hard to be invisible." Sophia leaned against her. "I like this version better." That night, after they'd eaten dinner canned soup heated on the camping stove, Elena made a decision. She pulled out the box, the photographs, the letters she'd read a dozen times by now. "Mija," she said. "Come here. I want to show you something." Sophia came and sat cross-legged beside her. Elena spread the photographs across the floor between them. "This was your great-grandmother," Elena said, pointing to the image of the young woman standing in front of the chapel. "Her name was Maria Elena Vargas. She lived here, in this chapel." Sophia leaned closer, studying the photograph. "She looks like you." "Yeah, she does." "What happened to her?" Elena chose her words carefully. Age-appropriate, gentle, but honest. "She had a baby when she was very young, and the world told her she should be ashamed. So she gave the baby away to people who could take care of her. And she stayed here, alone, for the rest of her life." Sophia's eyes were wide. "That's sad." "It is. But she was brave, Mija. Even when the world told her she wasn't. Even when she was alone, she survived." "Is that baby? Was that Abuela?" Elena's throat tightened. Her daughter was so smart. Too smart, sometimes. Yes, that was your grandmother. Sophia was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, is that why we came here? Because of her? Elena paused. She'd asked herself that question 100 times. Why this chapel? Why this place? Why they'd ended up here? Of all the places they could have run to. I think maybe she brought us here, Elena said finally. Sophia nodded, like that made perfect sense. Then she picked up the photograph and held it carefully, reverently. Can I keep this? To remember her? Yeah, baby. You can keep it. The next day, Elena did something impractical. Something that made no logical sense in the middle of the desert. She planted a garden. She drove into town and bought seeds, tomatoes, herbs, wildflowers. She tilled a small patch of earth outside the chapel door, working the soil until it was soft. She planted each seed with care, pressing them into the ground like prayers. It was an act of defiance, of hope, of believing that something could grow here, even in the harshness of this place. She watered it every morning, every evening, coaxed life from dust. Sophia helped, carrying water from the well in a bucket, her small hands careful not to spill. They worked side by side in the early light, mother and daughter, building something together. And slowly, impossibly, green shoots began to appear. Elena felt something she hadn't felt in years. Ownership. Not just of the chapel, but of her story. Her life. Her choices. She wasn't running anymore. She was building. She was becoming the woman her grandmother had been the one who survived when the world said she shouldn't. The one who made a home from ruins. One evening, as the sun set and painted the desert gold, Elena lit candles at the altar. She arranged them carefully, their flames steady in the still air. She knelt, not to pray, she still didn't know how to do that, but to acknowledge, to say thank you. Thank you to a woman she'd never met but finally understood. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for leaving the letters. Thank you for showing me that silence doesn't have to be inherited, that we can choose something different. Sophia came and knelt beside her, quiet. Not asking questions, just being there. And Elena realized this was what Maria Elena had wanted. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just to be remembered. To know that her life had mattered, that someone would find the truth and carry it forward. Mama? Sophia whispered. Yeah, baby? I'm glad we're here. Elena pulled her daughter close, kissed the top of her head. Me too, mija. Me too. Outside, the garden grew. Inside, the candles burned. And the chapel, this place that had held so much silence for so long, finally felt like it was breathing again, like it was coming back to life. Elena waited 3 days before making the call. 3 days of rehearsing what she'd say. 3 days of picking up her phone and setting it back down. On the 4th day, she drove into town, sat in the parking lot of the hardware store where the signal was strongest, and dialed. Her mother answered on the 3rd ring. Elena? The sound of her name and her mother's voice, sharp, uncertain, made her throat close. Yeah, Mom. It's me. Silence. Then, where are you? Are you safe? We're safe. That's not what I asked. Elena looked out at the desert stretching endlessly beyond the parking lot. I can't tell you where we are yet. Her mother's breath was sharp, angry, but underneath it, Elena heard something else. Fear. He's been calling, looking for you. Elena's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What did you tell him? Nothing. What could I tell him? You disappeared. The accusation hung between them. You left. You ran. You didn't trust me enough to say goodbye. Elena forced herself to speak. Mom, I need to tell you something. About where we are. Elena, please, just listen. Her mother went quiet. Elena told her about the chapel. About buying it with money she'd saved in secret. About restoring it. piece by piece, about finding the box beneath the altar. There were letters, Elena said, from a priest, and photographs of a woman named Maria Elena Vargas. The silence on the other end of the line changed, became heavy. Mom, she was your mother. I don't want to talk about her. Her mother's voice was flat, final. She loved you. Stop. She didn't have a choice. She gave me away. Her mother's voice cracked, not with anger, with something raw. She gave me to strangers and told them to pretend I'd never existed. Elena closed her eyes. She saved you. That's not what it felt like. The line went quiet again. Elena could hear her mother breathing, could picture her standing in the kitchen of the house. Elena had grown up in the same kitchen where questions about family had always been met with silence. She stayed in that chapel for 40 years, Elena said quietly, alone. She tried to find you once, but you'd moved. There was no trail. So she waited, and she prayed. And she left letters, hoping someone would find them, hoping you'd know. Her mother didn't respond. She wrote that she loved you, that she never stopped thinking about you, that giving you away was the hardest thing she ever did. Then why did she do it? Because the world didn't give her another option. Silence. Elena waited. Let the words settle. I have to go, her mother said finally. Her voice was shaking. Mom. The line went dead. Elena sat in the parking lot for a long time after that, staring at her phone, feeling the weight of what she'd done. She'd named the wound, spoken the silence aloud, and her mother had hung up. But something had shifted. Elena could feel it. She drove back to the chapel. Sophia was outside, watering the garden. The tomato plants had sprouted tiny green leaves. Against all odds, they were growing. Did you call Abuela? Sophia asked. Yeah. Is she mad? Elena knelt beside her daughter. I think she's sad. But maybe that's better than nothing. 5 days later, a letter arrived. Forwarded from the post office box Elena had rented in town under a name that wasn't quite hers. The handwriting on the envelope was her mother's. Elena opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a photograph. Old. Creased. A young woman holding a baby. The woman's face was full of something Elena had never seen in any other picture love, raw and unguarded, mixed with grief so deep it looked like drowning. Maria Elena, holding her daughter, the only photograph that had survived. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I didn't know how. Elena stood at the altar that evening, the photograph in her hands. She placed it carefully beside the others, the image of Maria Elena standing in front of the chapel, the pictures she'd found in the box, and now this one. The only evidence that her grandmother had held her child, even if only for a moment. A small altar. A gallery of women who had survived when the world told them they shouldn't. Sophia appeared beside her, quiet. She studied the photographs for a long moment. Mama? She said finally. Yeah, baby? Will we stay here forever? Elena looked around the chapel. The walls she'd patched, the windows she'd replaced, the floor she'd swept clean, the garden outside, green against the desert. This place had become something she hadn't expected. Not just shelter, not just safety, home, but she thought about her mother's letter, about the wound finally named, about the possibility, small, fragile, but real, of something different. Maybe not forever, Elena said. But for now, Sophia nodded, slipped her hand into Elena's, and they stood together in the candlelight. 3 generations of women converging in a chapel that had learned to breathe again. The chapel was finished. It wasn't perfect. Cracks still showed in places where the adobe had settled unevenly. The desert wind still found its way through gaps Elena hadn't been able to seal. But it was whole. The roof held. The windows let in light. The floor was clean. Elena had made it theirs. She stood in the doorway one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the desert. The light came slowly here, first gray, then pink, then gold, like the world was remembering how to be beautiful. She'd made a decision. The chapel was too much space for just the two of them, and it had never been meant to hold only one family's story. So once a month, she opened the doors, not as a church. She still didn't know how to pray, but as a gathering space, a place for people who needed quiet, who needed to sit in silence that felt like listening instead of judgment. People came. Not many. A handful. Enough. They sat on the benches Elena had built from salvaged wood. They looked at the photographs on the wall, the gallery of women who had survived. They didn't ask questions. They just Saturday. And when they left, some of them thanked her. Some of them cried. One afternoon, an older woman arrived. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane, her face lined with decades of desert Sunday. I knew her, the woman said, pointing to Maria Elena's photograph. We were girls together. Elena's breath caught. You knew my grandmother? The woman nodded. She was stubborn, proud. She laughed louder than anyone I ever knew. She paused, her eyes distant. Until she stopped laughing altogether. She told Elena stories about Maria Elena, before the shame, before the silence, about a girl who'd wanted to be a teacher, who'd loved music, who'd believed the world could be kind if you were brave enough. She loved this place, the woman said. Even after it broke her, she stayed because she believed it was holy. Not the building, the act of staying. Elena listened, tears streaming down her face, grateful for these pieces of a woman she'd never meet but would carry forever. Sophia was changing too. She'd made a friend in town, a girl her age, named Carmen. They rode bikes through the desert on weekends, laughing as they chased lizards and collected stones. Elena watched from the chapel doorway, her heart so full it ached. Her daughter wasn't afraid anymore, wasn't looking over her shoulder, wasn't asking in a small voice if they were safe. She was just a child, playing, living. One night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Elena sat at the altar with a pen and paper. She didn't know who the letter was for. Maybe Sophia, years from now, when she was old enough to understand. Maybe herself. Maybe whoever would come after them and find it buried beneath the stone. She wrote about survival, about the women who had come before her, Maria Elena, her mother, herself, about the silence that had been passed down like an heirloom and the choice to break it. She wrote about the chapel, about what it had been and what it had become, about how places could hold pain and still transform into something sacred. She wrote about Sophia, about choosing to mother differently, about teaching her daughter that shame wasn't inheritance, that silence wasn't safety, that the truth, even when it hurt, was always better than the lie. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully, placed it in a small wooden box, and buried it beneath the altar, next to Maria Elena's letters. A message for the future. Proof that someone had been here, that they had mattered, that they had chosen to speak. The desert settled into autumn. The garden somehow survived small tomatoes ripening in the sun, herbs growing thick and fragrant. Elena cooked with them, teaching Sophia the names in Spanish her own mother had never taught her. One evening, as the sun set and turned the world to gold, Elena and Sophia sat outside the chapel. The air was cooling. The wind had gentled. Above them, stars began to appear so many, you could see the curve of the galaxy. Sophia leaned against her mother, warm and solid and safe. I like it here, Mama, she said quietly. Elena kissed the top of her head, breathed in the smell of her shampoo and sun and desert dust. Me too, mija. Me too. They sat together as the light faded, mother and daughter, the latest in a line of women who had learned to survive when the world said they shouldn't. Behind them, the chapel stood against the darkening sky. Lights glowed softly from within, candles Elena had lit at the altar. Flames steady and sure. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a testament to Maria Elena, who had endured 40 years of silence, to Elena's mother, who had grown up not knowing but feeling the wound anyway, to Elena herself, who had run across 3 states and found not just shelter, but understanding, and to Sophia, who would grow up knowing the truth, who would carry these stories forward without shame, who would understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay and rebuild and speak. The chapel had been a place of secrets, of hiding, of shame. Now it was a place of survival, of healing, of beginning again. The wind whispered through the garden, the candles burned, and in the desert silence, something like peace settled over them. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole. Sometimes the places we run to are the ones that have been waiting for us all along. Elena didn't just restore a chapel, she uncovered a truth buried beneath generations of silence. And in doing so, she freed herself from a pain she didn't know she carried. The past doesn't ask for perfection. It asks to be seen, to be spoken, to be forgiven. And when we finally find the courage to name what was hidden, we don't just heal ourselves, we heal everyone who comes after. The cracks don't disappear, but they become part of the foundation. Proof that we survived, that we rebuilt, that we chose truth over silence and love over shame.